It's the world is watching these powers be in a stuck place where they did come for 10 months or so and attempt to negotiate fits and starts and some progress, some steps back, but a summit between the American president and the Russian president, a lot of meetings, right? But the issue here is that neither side will give up on their demands. Right. And so you just essentially can't see the Russian side saying that they're going to accept anything than the full outline of the four provinces that they annexed following their invasion in 2022. Right. You just can't see the Russians doing anything other than that. That was the bare minimum that they would accept, as well as too the larger issues, which are more important to the Russians, of Ukraine's role in Europe, Ukraine's place. The Russians want neutrality for Ukraine in a way that was similar that the Austrians and the Finns had neutrality following World War II. So it's based upon models that worked. And a demilitarization of Ukraine and a denazification, as the Russians call it. Essentially, they don't want the right wing empowering Ukraine. You could see them backing away from some of those demands, right, or compromising on some of them, but not by much. And the Russians believe that they are in a stronger position militarily, economically, politically than not just Ukraine, but Europe and the United States. Right. So the Russians look at this and they see their military forces in Ukraine slowly, very, very slowly. But they have they're moving westward. They have their upper hand. Economically, they have done very well through 19 rounds of sanctions. Their economy is growing at a slower pace this year, only because they had to restrain growth in the last couple of years because their economy did so well. Again, in spite of all these sanctions, they've found new markets. They've developed and enriched existing relationships, right? Rather than sending their natural gas to Europe, and then Nord Stream pipeline destruction ended that. Well, now they're going to send all that gas to China, and they don't ever care about having to send that gas to Europe ever again because China's going to consume more gas than Europe ever would. So that's the position they see themselves in. And also, too, in terms of the industrial aspects of the warfare, the Russians view themselves, and I think correctly, as having defeated to this point the entire West in terms of industry. The Russians are building so many weapons and munitions and missiles that while they're in the midst of the largest conventional war since World War II, they're beginning to export, to sail overseas again, weapon systems. That's
They're
how well
sending,
their industrial economy is doing supporting the war.
they're sending weapons to Iran. They're sending weapons to Venezuela.
Right. And then you look at the Ukrainian side of this, the way the Russians see it is that they see Ukraine as politically divided. Majority of Ukrainians support negotiations. Almost the majority of Ukrainians support ceding land for peace, which is a huge development. You see the issues of the disunity on this issue throughout Europe and through the United States. They see the way that the West, who declared essentially that we would defeat the Russians in Ukraine through our factories, through our plants, right, through our facilities, our laboratories, et cetera, has failed to do that. It's failed to do that. Russia is building more drones, missiles, tanks, whatever metric you want to look at, whatever piece of equipment, munition you want to look at. They're building more than the West combined in orders of magnitude of 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or more. And advancements in terms of the technological advancements, it appears to me as an analyst, the Russians have demonstrated a greater progression in their weapon systems, particularly their missiles and drones, than the West have, and particularly their ballistic missiles. They have some ballistic missiles now. They just tested another one this week that are very, very scary systems, that are weapon systems to which the West cannot counter. The United States military has no way to shoot down many of these weapon systems. And we know as well, our top tier of the line, the Patriot air defense system, that only shoots down, as we found out last month, about 8% of Russia's ballistic missiles. So this is the way the Russians view it, And then we didn't get into the economics, the finance of it. Ukraine's got a $70 billion budget gap. I mean, if you look at the wars in Vietnam and Afghanistan, how did those governments collapse? What happened? Certainly, there's a lot of military pressure put on them, but the big things were either the actual loss of money coming in to keep the house of cards that were those governments in power. Whether it was Vietnam or Afghanistan, that's what causes the governments to collapse. And so I think the Ukrainians are looking at that. I mean, sort of the Russians are looking at it that way, that you've got essentially a house of cards in Kyiv, just like Afghanistan, Vietnam, et cetera, a house of cards that's essentially a corrupt patronage network. And then once the money starts coming in, there'll be a panic and it will collapse. Why the Russians would want to have a collapsed country, a failed state right next to them, I don't know. I think this is why I think their invasion was just not, illegal, but also unsound. It had its reasons. Don't get me wrong. I understand why they did it, but this is why I believe it's unsound, because now they're stuck. Say, well, okay, all this said, and putting that from the Russian perspective, and I know it was very long-winded, but that's from the Russian perspective, why they're keeping this going. Why would they not keep it going? Unless, if you're the Russians and that's the way you view this, why would you do anything differently than what they're doing? And in fact, they're amping up the pressure. They're launching more strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure. If you've seen Putin recently in the last several weeks, he does this occasionally, but I feel like he's doing more right now. These videos where he's being briefed by his military generals. Today I saw one. He's got camouflage on. He's sitting in front of his generals. His generals are telling him how great the war's going. They're probably lying to him like all generals lie. But the point being is that he believes it. The Russian people believe it. The war is still very popular in Russia. Vladimir Putin is very popular in Russia still. That's undeniable. The economic hardships that we were told the sanctions would bring certainly have not been delivered. In many ways, the Russian economy is stronger. This current issue with the Russian oil refineries being hit by drones, it's giving them some issues, but it's not going to bring about the end of their government, not going to bring about the end of the war, and within a few months, the Russians will have figured out how to handle it.
Good Lord. So what's going on the other side? We know, meaning the NATO and the Western Europe side.
And they're crazy.
Just a mania. A couple weeks ago, Ursula von der Leyen, the EU chair, the commissioner, the highest person in the European Union, came out and gave a little press conference. And they had just had a meeting, the EU meeting, and they said the two priorities for the European Union for this next year are building up our armies and winning the war in Ukraine. This is a European Union that is overseeing a Europe that is at the worst state it has been in 50 years. Maybe, right? Maybe, I know the 70s weren't great for Europe, say particularly the UK, but who's no longer part of the EU. But the idea that with all the issues in Europe right now, the high costs of living, the housing issues, the deindustrialization, the massive budget problems, the cuts to services, the immigration and refugee crises they're having, the rise of the right wing, all these things that the priority for the EU is going to be building their armies and winning the war in Ukraine. With all right, I mean,
it's
so
awful.
it's incredible. This is I think what you have essentially in Europe. Why are they so beholden to this idea? Why won't they let Ukraine go? Why are they so willing, one, to let Ukrainians be slaughtered for their goals, their aspirations, their desires, not for Ukrainian ones, right? For European political ones. Why are they so afraid to let go of that? And it's because their entire identity is bottled up in that. More or less, leaders across Europe are in incredibly unpopular governments. You look at the Germans, you look at the Brits, the French. I mean, the popularity of Merz, Starmer, Macron. I mean, you add them up, it doesn't even come to 25% probably. Maybe 30% between the three of them. I mean, it is insane how unpopular these governments are. And the idea being is that, well, we need a foreign enemy. We need some type of outside threat to unify our people. I think that's what they're moving forward on. Is that what we have to do is distract people from the conditions here at home by an overseas war, as well as that just with like the Democratic Party did with, a decade plus of demonizing Russia and trying to tie the Republican Party and Donald Trump to the Russians. You now invested your identity in that. So to be a Democrat in the U.S. is to be anti-Russian. To be right, I mean, to be, and not just anti-Russian in the sense that I don't like those guys, I don't think we should trade with them, but like, no, we should go to war with them. And that's certainly been the way that those who are in the ruling coalitions throughout Europe have positioned themselves, where this war in Ukraine is their identity. That this is what, okay, I know things are bad, I know things are expensive, I know you have a choice between heat or heating or eating this winter, all those types of things, right? But at least I'm a small d Democrat. I'm a European. I'm against the tyranny that's going to come from the East. That's the way they've packaged themselves. And so now to go and negotiate with what you were explaining to your people were existential threats for the last 5 years, 10 years, however long, that's a very hard thing to do. That would certainly just collapse whatever little political sport you have. And there's also megalomania. I think with van der Leyen, with Kaja Kallas, the European Union foreign minister, I think there's a megalomania there. I think van der Leyen goes to bed at night and thinks about being the first commander-in-chief of a European-wide army, the commander-in-chief of the EU army that's been spoken about for decades, right, of achieving that. So I think there's all these things that wrap into this really simple notion that they believe the politics is good for the war, or the war is good for politics, excuse me. And I mean, at the meantime, they simply can't keep up with supply and support that Ukraine needs. The Ukrainians have two major issues in terms of their military and continuing this war. One is the manpower issue, but you have to recall that Ukraine doesn't draft people below the age of 26. So the 18 to 25-year-olds are not drafted in Ukraine. I mean, that's something different than pretty much anywhere I know of, but that's the way the system works there. So for, I think, many Ukrainians, for many Europeans, many Americans, the idea is like, if we could just get Ukraine to draft that half generation of young men and women, and particularly young men, then they can keep their front lines manned. And if we can keep this money flowing into Ukraine, then we can keep this house of cards upright. I mean, the economic conditions of Ukraine are dire. It's just not their military that's short of manpower. It's their economy. They've had such a drop in their population, more than 10 million essentially, that they are millions of people short to run their economy. I mean, so there's issues all along here that, you look at Ukraine rightly as a house of cards. And so the idea being is that the Europeans and many Americans, like Lindsey Graham or Richard Blumenthal in the Senate, if we can just provide the amount of money needed to sustain this, to keep the house of cards upright, well, then in 2 or 3 years' time, the experts are telling us that the Russian economy is going to collapse, the people are going to turn on Vladimir Putin, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and we will have won. I mean, that was supposed to have occurred already 2 or 3 times.
Exactly.
But this is what, they believe, what the experts tell them, and what's good for their own political identity. So they pursue it. And the cost, of course, to the Ukrainians is massive. It's absolutely massive. And then you have the other issues too with the West, where again they've been defeated. As I said earlier, the West said they would win this war against Russia, or would help Ukraine win this war against Russia through our factories, our plants, our laboratories, our facilities, right? And simply haven't done that. Not only are we, the NATO countries, producing weapons to provide Ukraine in the volume that they need. Not that the Ukrainians have the manpower to utilize them, right? But what our stocks are empty. We're running out of weapon systems throughout all the NATO armies. You look at what happened in the 12-day war between Iran and Israel. And essentially, Donald Trump, one of the reasons why he intervenes with the B-2 bomber strikes on Iran is to bring about a closing act to do something to provide cover, to give an explanation for why the war is over. Oh, we bombed their nuclear sites. We don't need to do this anymore. Well,
Right.
why did they do that then? It's because one of the reasons, one of the key reasons, is because both the Americans and the Israelis were running out of their air defense missiles. And so in 12 days, we were running out of those missiles. I mean, you saw how the American Navy performed against the Houthis under both the Biden and the Trump administrations. We were defeated. We had to retreat from the Red Sea.
Right.
Right. I mean, so you look at those things, but then you look at also too, leaving, getting back to this point that our stocks are bare. We run out of weapon systems. We can't produce what the Ukrainians need. We can't even produce what we need. As an aside, I'll say, and people then want us to fight China. Right? It's insane, right? But the other aspect is that our generals have been defeated. One of the best things the New York Times has done, and I'm not a huge fan of the Times, but they ran a massive story last March or April. They called it The Secret War in Ukraine or something like that. And Adam Entos was the author of it. And really long piece, excellent, but it explained how the American generals in Germany and Wiesbaden, to be specific, have been the ones who have been executing the war in Ukraine. That the big arrow movements of the Ukrainian army throughout this war have been decided and commanded from Germany by American generals. So when you go back and you look at the various campaigns in this war in Ukraine, those are American generals who are behind it. And especially the 2023 spring offensive that the Ukrainians disastrously, catastrophically conducted against the Russian defense lines. And, that was American generals behind that. So the American generals have been defeated by the Russian generals. And this is not something that we here in the US or those in Europe are stopping and taking account of. Like, why are we pursuing this militarism? Why are we banging the drums of war? Why are we walking around poking people in the chest and in the eye when we've been defeated by the Houthis? We had to essentially create a stunt to prevent the Iran war from going on. And the Russian generals and their factories, their industries, have defeated us so far in Ukraine.
Right.
It's madness. It's absolutely madness to go on with this.
Yeah. If we've got generals running it, does that mean, well, let's put it this way. How many lower rank people, lower rank Americans are actually on the ground in Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. We certainly a lot less than there were in the first year of the war when you had many volunteers go there, right? But certainly you have American forces, I would estimate probably in the hundreds, that are in Ukraine, whether they are CIA and Army and CIA and JSOC forces, so Special Operations Forces, whether it's contractors, whether it's mercenaries, or whether it's American military officers who are there in some type of advised capacity. Most of that does occur outside of Ukraine, though. Any of the traditional, conventional military aspects, from what I understand, are largely done outside of Ukraine, in Poland and Germany, as we were just talking about, and other locations. But no, I would estimate probably, Jim, that there are hundreds of Americans involved in the war in Ukraine in a covert capacity. And just as there are many like that from Poland, Germany, Britain, et cetera.
Yeah. So we get bled dry, and Xi Jinping just sits back and watches the whole mess with a big smile on his face, saying, "Yeah, give us a decade, we'll help clean up."
The China, this is dated. This is a couple of years old, but a couple of years ago, so a year and a half into the war there, the Chinese were the biggest supplier of drones to both sides, I believe. Right. I mean, like, just sitting back and say, let's watch these idiots kill each other and make a ton of money off of it. I don't believe that's I don't believe that's the case any longer. But certainly, I had a friend of mine who went to China. This would have been like 2010, 2011, and he met with folks from the Chinese Foreign Ministry, and his question to them was, what do you want to see American foreign what would you like American foreign policy to look like going forward? This, again, it was 2010, 2011. And they said, we want America to remain bogged down in endless wars overseas. This is what the Chinese Foreign Ministry folks said to, and it makes perfect. And you just see the way the Chinese are conducting themselves on the world stage. Like, I certainly don't want to be a miner in a Chinese-owned mine in Africa. I'm not throwing
Right.
praise at them, right? They certainly have a lot of warts and things that we could pick on. But in terms of what they're replacing, their model is I don't want to call it imperialist because it's so far from what we understand imperialism. Our foreign policy is imperialist,
Mhm.
right? I mean, so maybe the Chinese are more of a mercantilist policy.
Yeah, right.
Right? But their priority is to be the dominant the dominant power in the world through their economy, through their
Mhm.
finance, right, through their politics, not not through their military, which is and that their understanding of how to lead the world is through cooperation. It's through
Right.
persuasion. It's through mutual benefit, right? While
Mhm.
the American style has been the way of the empires. We're the empire, and this
Mhm.
is what we demand, and this is what we'll get.
Mhm.
I mean, there's a quote from an African minister a few years ago where he said, when the Americans come, we get a lecture, and then we get commandos and drones.
Mhm.
When the Chinese come, we have a conversation, and then we get ports and railroads. I mean, so that model there is just it's undeniable,
Mhm.
in the threat that it poses to the West. This is where people, I think, uh, why it's not compatible, why we can't have both the Chinese and the American
Mhm.
models, because the amount of wealth that is drawn, that is taken out, that's exploited, extracted from the global South by the global North, the West, is massive. It's anywhere from, for every dollar the West puts into the global South, anywhere between $4 and $14 is extracted from the global South. I mean, it is an incredible grift. It's an incredible effort of exploitation that no one else can be allowed to cut into,
Right.
right? And so I think that's why among other things, the hysteria from the West about the Chinese, especially the Americans, is because they're cutting in on our good thing, right?
Mhm.
And while, go back to before World War II, our good thing was primarily Central and South America, and we enshrined that in the Monroe Doctrine. But with the end of World War II, the Cold War, and then the end of the Cold War, these last 30 years, there's simply American primacy. And,
Mhm.
both the Clinton and the George H.W. Bush administrations both had, in either their national security strategies or their national defense strategies, I can't remember which, essentially the idea that we are the prime nation in the globe. This is our
Yeah.
world.
Mhm.
And under both the H.W. Bush and Clinton administrations, this is
Mhm.
as we're entering into this new world following
Mhm.
the end of the Cold War. The policy was that anything that threatens our primacy must
Right.
be destroyed. That was the
Mhm.
policy as laid out by H.W. Bush and Clinton, was that we will destroy anything that threatens our position as the world's sole superpower.